friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Today, it is day 12. We have an even dozen of our read-along days of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Let's see, we're going to read 4 more chapters today. They are kind of long, so once again, I will try to be quick in this first summary. We'll see how it goes. Hi! Today's tea because I'm all excited about our reading, and I have a craft later on I'm going to give you a sneak preview of. But yeah, a little excited, and so again, you probably noticed when I have an exciting thing ahead of me, I try to have chamomile tea or something else calming like that to keep things nice and stable. Delicious, as always. All right, so just a quick little thing letting you guys know if you want to tune in later today at around 5 o'clock, I'm going to be leading a craft where I'm going to be taking little squares of paper. This is a recycled magazine, folding it up origami style into little cones, which then magically become a flower, which magically will become a kusadama ball, which I have not yet gotten to that point, so I've got a lot of folding to do after we finish today's reading. So we'll see how that goes, but if you want to tune in, let's hope it goes well. That's going to be at 5 o'clock, where you turn the magazines into papers, into flowers, and then into kusadama balls. So I think that the reason you're actually here is not for origami, fun though it is. You're here for Mark Twain's Roughing It. So let's talk a bit about what we read yesterday. Yesterday was a great reading. We had such adventures. Okay, so in chapter 39, we started out with Mark Twain talking about how he and his friend Higby, they went exploring around the lake. They had a little adventure where they got separated from the boat, and he didn't know if they'd be able to get back to the boat. And Higby jumped from the shore of the boat and said, you know, I could have just swam to the boat too. But again, with the alkali water around Mono Lake, Mark Twain hadn't even considered it because it would be so painful on his bruises and cuts and whatnot. Just who would jump into the lake? Just better to let the boat go, I guess. He talks about some other adventures that they have, and then he gets to the big one. In chapter 40, he finally gets to the story that was alluded to in the dedication of the book, where he talks about how he and Higby had been millionaires for 10 days. So we learn what that actually means. And it turns out what it means is there had been a mine, the Wide West mine, that was considered to be quite valuable. And his friend Higby realized, the stones that the ore that they're getting out of it is not really from their mine, but it's from the adjacent nearby area. It's a blind lead. Honestly, I don't quite understand what that means, but just for me, it was a nearby area that was not what was already claimed. It was unclaimed land. So Higby then gets Mark Twain and the foreman of the Wide West mine to go in as his partners, and they claim that land, the blind lead, where the real valuable stuff is at. And so they're so excited. And basically, once you claim the land, you just stick a notice on, you say, we claim this, and then you have to make improvements on the area. You have to do some work on it within 10 days. You don't have to do it the whole 10 days, but within 10 days, you have to do some work on it. So right after they claim it, there's a beautiful scene about Mark Twain and his friend Calvin Higby just talking to each other, sort of dreaming as they're spinning tales as they're lying in their respective beds that night, talking about what it's like to be a millionaire, because they're anticipating already their immense wealth. And well, what are you going to do? Are you going to stay here? Are you going to maybe go to San Francisco, maybe build a house? I don't know if I'd want to build it on Russian Hill. It'd be too hilly. It'd be too high. I'd have to walk so high. Well, why would you bother walking? Get a carriage. You're right. Why would I get a carriage? Actually, though, why even stay there? Let's go travel to Europe. How long would you stay? A couple weeks? Oh, a couple years. They've just got so much money in their minds that they can't, they're just spinning these beautiful, beautiful dreams about what they're going to do with all their money. However, the next day, Mark Twain is called to help their friend, Captain John Nye, who we talked about in the earlier reading. I think it was on Thursday. The gentleman who was so friendly that you would meet him, and then it turns out he knew everyone else who had ever met you, and he was just so sociable and so kind. And, he's just one of those wonderful people. And Captain John Nye was ill. And so Mark Twain leaves a note for his 2 partners and says, I'm sorry, I've got to go take care of him. You guys, stake the claim kind of thing. And so he takes off. He then goes and helps with Captain Nye, who is very dangerously sick. And eventually he realizes, he seems to be doing better. I think I can go back to town. I'll just walk. He's walking back to town, and he sees this bunch of men on the hill near where they had laid their claim. And he's like, oh, maybe somebody else found another claim. Good for them. I'm tired, I'm going home. And so he heads back, and when he gets back, he finds Higby. And Higby is looking unhappy. And basically what Higby reveals is that he had just himself gotten back to where they were lodging, and he had seen Mark Twain's note saying, hey, I need to take off to help Captain Nye, please work the claim. But he had not seen that note till just then. And the reason he hadn't seen the note is because he had gotten word from Whiteman, the gentleman who knew about the cement mine, and he had gone following with him to try to find that mythical cement mine buried or lost somewhere in the desert. So he himself had also missed the 10-day deadline. Fortunately, they had one other partner, so there was still a chance. But that partner, the former foreman of the Wild West mine, had also been called away. He'd received a telegram that somebody was ill and needed him, and so he'd left too. Now myself, I have suspicions that maybe it just worked out with bad luck, but maybe there was something a little hinky going on, like people tried to get them out of town. I don't know. But I do know that, according to Mark Twain, that all three of them had missed the opportunity to do even one day of work on the land that they had claimed, and therefore they had lost the rights to the mine. And so when Mark Twain had been walking up the hill and seen those men there, those were the men who were waiting to claim that land for themselves. And basically, Mr. A.D. Allen, the partner, the former foreman, he does manage to get part of that claim back by basically pulling a gun and saying, you're going to add me to that group of people who've claimed that new land, or I'm going to shoot a few people, and there's going to be less of you claiming that land. And so they add him into the group. It's a lovely story, and he basically says, it reads like a wild fancy sketch, but it's true. He swears up and down it's true. He says, the evidence of many witnesses is easily obtainable in proof that it is a true history. And I think it might be true too, based on the fact that he dedicates the book to his friend and reminisces about the time that they were briefly millionaires together. So I'd like to believe that story is true. It's also great too. He concludes the chapter with saying how Higby, who he and Higby had been talking about, like, well, even for $100,000, I wouldn't sell my rights to that land. It's worth so much. That Higby was now saying that he was so fortunate. At last, he had $2,500. So again, their dreams of wealth have shrunk down quite considerably. In chapter 42, Mark Twain talks about some of the many jobs in which he has tried and failed over the years, but finally he had been writing letters to a newspaper, and they've been publishing some of his pieces, and he'd been kind of thinking, yeah, maybe, this isn't such a good paper after all if they're publishing my stuff. Modesty. Now, I mean, Mark Twain is Mark Twain now, but back then, no, there was taking a bit more of a risk on him, perhaps. They offer him a job as editor of the paper, and so he ends up going to Virginia City to become the editor of the paper. And it's interesting too, because he talks about the good advice he got about how you should never say, oh, it was reported, or we learned. You just say it is. You dig into the facts, you get the facts, you report the facts, not speculation. This is what a true newspaperman does. And Mark Twain praises that assessment, and is like, yes, when he reads the paper himself, if he sees we heard or we learned, it's like, But he then follows up that endorsement of that idea of what it means to be a journalist by talking about how he then began canvassing the town and talking to people to try to get stories that he could write about, and just wasn't getting enough information. So he started embellishing a little bit. And so, for example, if there was somebody who was about to go out of town, like they were going on the wagon train and going out, he might make up a story involving them, like perhaps they got massacred. Just a little thing, because they wouldn't be around to refute the evidence or refute the story. And so right after saying that, that he believed in what Mr. Goodman, the owner of the paper, had said about reporting only the facts, he then goes on and sort of livens them up a little bit. So Mark Twain, known more for his humorous writing than his journalism. So today we're going to read 4 chapters together. We're going to read chapters 43 through 46 of Roughing It by Mark Twain. Let's go ahead and start with chapter 43. However, as I grew better acquainted with the business and learned the run of the sources of information, I ceased to require the aid of fancy to any large extent, and I became able to fill my columns without diverging noticeably from the domain of fact. I struck up friendships with the reporters of the other journals, and we swapped regulars with each other and thus economized work. Regulars are permanent sources of news, like courts, bullion reports, cleanups at the court's mills, and inquests. Inasmuch as everybody went armed, we had an inquest about every day, and so this department was naturally set down among my regulars. We had lively papers in those days. My great competitor among the reporters was Boggs of the Union. He was an excellent reporter. Once in 3 or 4 months he would get a little intoxicated, but as a general thing he was a wary and cautious drinker, although always ready to tamper a little with the enemy. He had the advantage of me in one thing. He could get the monthly public school report, and I could not, because the principal hated the enterprise. One snowy night when the report was due, I started out sadly, wondering how I was going to get it. Presently, a few steps up the almost deserted street, I stumbled on Boggs and asked him where he was going. After the school report. I'll go along with you. No, sir. I'll excuse you. Just as you say. A saloon keeper's boy passed by with a steaming pitcher of hot punch, and Boggs snuffed the fragrance gratefully. He gazed fondly after the boy and saw him start up the Enterprise stairs. I said, I wish you could help me get that school business, but since you can't, I must run up to the union office and see if I can get them to let me have a proof of it after they have set it up, though I don't begin to suppose they will. Good night. Hold on a minute. I don't mind getting the report and sitting around with the boys a little bit while you copy it, if you're willing to drop down on the principals with me. Now you talk like a rational being. Come along. We plowed a couple of blocks through the snow, got the report, and returned to our office. It was a short document and soon copied. Meantime, Boggs helped himself to the punch. I gave the manuscript back to him, and we started out to get an inquest, for we heard pistol shots nearby. We got the particulars with little loss of time, for it was only an inferior sort of barroom murder, and of little interest to the public, and then we separated. Away at 3 o'clock in the morning, when we had gone to press and were having a relaxing concert as usual, for some of the printers were good singers, and others good performers on the guitar, and on that atrocity the accordion, the proprietor of the union strode in and desired to know if anybody had heard anything of Boggs or the school report. We stated the case, and all turned out to help hunt for the delinquent. We found him standing on a table in a saloon with an old tin lantern in one hand and the school report in the other, haranguing a gang of intoxicated Cornish miners on the iniquity of squandering the public monies on education, when hundreds and hundreds of honest, hard-working men are literally starving for whiskey. Riotous applause. He had been assisting in a regal spree with those parties for hours. We dragged him away and put him to bed. Of course, there was no school report in the union, and Boggs held me accountable, though I was innocent of any intention or desire to compass its absence from that paper, and was as sorry as anyone that the misfortune had occurred. But we were perfectly friendly. The day that the school report was next due, the proprietor of the Genesee mine furnished us a buggy and asked us to go down and write something about the property. A very common request, and one always gladly acceded to when people furnished buggies, for we were as fond of pleasure excursions as other people. In due time, we arrived at the mine. Nothing but a hole in the ground 90 feet deep, and no way of getting down into it but by holding onto a rope and being lowered with the windlass. The workmen had just gone off somewhere to dinner. I was not strong enough to lower Boggs's bulk, so I took an unlighted candle in my teeth, made a loop for my foot in the end of the rope, implored Boggs not to go to sleep or let the windlass get the start of him, and then swung out over the shaft. I reached the bottom muddy and bruised about the elbows, but safe. I lit the candle, made an examination of the rock, selected some specimens, and shouted to Boggs to heist away. No answer. Presently, a head appeared in the circle of daylight away aloft, and a voice came down. Are you all set? All set. Hoist away. Are you comfortable? Perfectly. Could you wait a little? Oh, certainly. No particular hurry. Well, goodbye. Why? Where are you going? After the school report. And he did. I stayed down there an hour and surprised the workmen when they hauled up and found a man on the rope instead of a bucket of rock. I walked home, too. 5 miles. Uphill. We had no school report next morning, but the union had. 6 months after my entry into journalism, the grand flush times of Silverland began, and they continued with unabated splendor for 3 years. All difficulty about filling up the local department ceased, and the only trouble now was how to make the lengthened columns hold the world of incidents and happenings that came to our literary net every day. Virginia had grown to be the liveliest town, for its age and population, that America had ever produced. The sidewalks swarmed with people, to such an extent indeed that it was generally no easy matter to stem the human tide. The streets themselves were just as crowded with quartz wagons, freight teams, and other vehicles. The procession was endless. So great was the pack that buggies frequently had to wait half an hour for an opportunity to cross the principal street. Joy sat on every countenance, and there was a glad, almost fierce intensity in every eye that told of the money-getting schemes that were seething in every brain, and the high hope that held sway in every heart. Money was as plenty as dust. Every individual considered himself wealthy, and a melancholy countenance was nowhere to be seen. There were military companies, fire companies, brass bands, banks, hotels, theaters, hurdy-gurdy houses, wide-open gambling palaces, political powwows, civic processions, street fights, murders, inquests, riots, a whiskey mill every 15 steps. A board of aldermen, a mayor, a city surveyor, a city engineer, a chief of the fire department with first, second, and third assistants, a chief of police, city marshal, and a large police force, 2 boards of mining brokers, a dozen breweries, and half a dozen jails and station houses in full operation, and some talk of building a church. The flush times were in magnificent flower. Large fireproof brick buildings were going up in the principal streets, and the wooden suburbs were spreading out in all directions. Town lots soared up to prices that were amazing. The great Comstock lode stretched its opulent length straight through the town from north to south, and every mine on it was in diligent process of development. One of these mines alone employed 675 men, and in the matter of elections, the adage was, "As the Gould and Curry goes, so goes the city." Laboring men's wages were $4 and $6 a day, and they worked in 3 shifts or gangs, and the blasting and picking and shoveling went on without ceasing, night and day. The city of Virginia roosted royally midway up the steep side of Mount Davidson, 7,200 feet above the level of the sea, and in the clear Nevada atmosphere was visible from a distance of 50 miles. It claimed a population of 15,000 to 18,000, and all day long, half of this little army swarmed the streets like bees, and the other half swarmed among the drifts and tunnels of the Comstock, hundreds of feet down in the earth directly under those same streets. Often we felt our chairs jar and heard the faint boom of a blast down in the bowels of the earth under the office. The mountainside was so steep that the entire town had a slant to it like a roof. Each street was a terrace, and from each to the next street below the descent was 40 or 50 feet. The fronts of the houses were level with the street they faced, but their rear first doors were propped on lofty stilts. A man could stand at a rear first floor window of a C Street house and look down the chimneys of the row of houses below him, facing D Street. It was a laborious climb in that thin atmosphere to ascend from D to A Street, and you were panting and out of breath when you got there. But you could turn around and go down again like a house of fire, so to speak. The atmosphere was so rarefied on account of the great altitude that one's blood lay near the surface always, and the scratch of a pin was a disaster worth worrying about, for the chances were that a grievous crysipelas would ensue. But to offset this, the thin atmosphere seemed to carry healing to gunshot wounds, and therefore, to simply shoot your adversary through both lungs was a thing not likely to afford you any permanent satisfaction, for he would be nearly certain to be around looking for you within the month, and not with an opera glass either. From Virginia's airy situation, one could look over a vast, far-reaching panorama of mountain ranges and deserts, and whether the day was bright or overcast, whether the sun was rising or setting or flaming in the zenith, or whether night and the moon held sway, the spectacle was always impressive and beautiful. Over your head, Mount Davidson lifted its gray dome, and before and below you a rugged canyon clove the battlemented hills, making a somber gateway through which a soft-tinted desert was glimpsed, with the silver thread of a river winding through it, bordered with trees which many miles of distance diminished to a delicate fringe. And still further away, and still further away, the snowy mountains rose up and stretched their long barrier to the filmy horizon, far enough beyond a lake that burned in the desert like a fallen sun, though that itself lay 50 miles removed. Look from your window where you would, there was fascination in the picture. At rare intervals, but very rare, there were clouds in our skies, and then the setting sun would gild and flush and glorify this mighty expanse of scenery with a bewildering pomp of color that held the eye like a spell and moved the spirit like music. And now chapter 44. My salary was increased to $40 a week, but I seldom drew it. I had plenty of other resources, and what were 2 broad $20 gold pieces to a man who had his pockets full of such and a cumbersome abundance of bright half-dollars besides? Paper money has never come into use on the Pacific coast. Reporting was lucrative, and every man in the town was lavish with his money and his feet. The city and all the great mountainside were riddled with mining shafts. There were more mines than miners. True, not 10 of these mines were yielding rock worth hauling to a mill, but everybody said, wait till a shaft gets down where the ledge comes in solid and then you will see. So nobody was discouraged. These were nearly all wildcat mines and wholly worthless, but nobody believed it then. The Ophir, the Gold and Curry, the Mexican, and other great mines on the Comstock lead in Virginia and Gold Hill were turning out huge piles of rich rock every day, and every man believed that his little wildcat claim was as good as any on the mainland and would infallibly be worth $1,000 a foot when he got down where it came in solid. Poor fellow, he was blessedly blind to the fact that he never would see that day. So the 1,000 wildcat shafts burrowed deeper and deeper into the earth day by day, and all men were besides themselves with hope and happiness. How they labored, prophesied, exulted. Sure, nothing like it was ever seen before since the world began. Every one of these wildcat mines, not mines, but holes in the ground over imaginary mines, was incorporated and had handsomely engraved stock, and the stock was saleable too. It was bought and sold with a feverish avidity in the boards every day. You could go up on the mountainside, scratch around and find a ledge, there was no lack of them, put up a notice with a grandiloquent name on it, start a shaft, get your stock printed, and with nothing whatever to prove that your mine was worth a straw, you could put your stock on the market and sell out for hundreds and even thousands of dollars. To make money, and make it fast, was as easy as it was to eat your dinner. Every man owned feet in 50 different wildcat mines and considered his fortune made. Think of a city with not one solitary poor man in it. One would suppose that when month after month went by and still not a wildcat mine, by wildcat I mean, in general terms, any claim not located on the mother vein, i.e. the Comstock, yielded a ton of rock worth crushing, the people would begin to wonder if they were not putting too much faith in their prospective riches. But there was not a thought of such a thing. They burrowed away, bought and sold, and were happy. New claims were taken up daily, and it was the friendly custom to run straight to the newspaper offices, give the reporter 40 or 50 feet, and get them to go and examine the mine and publish a notice of it. They did not care a fig what you said about the property, so you said something. Consequently, we generally said a word or two to the effect that the indications were good, or that the ledge was 6 feet wide, or that the rock resembled the Comstock. And so it did, but as a general thing, the resemblance was not startling enough to knock you down. If the rock was moderately promising, we followed the custom of the country, used strong adjectives, and frothed at the mouth as if it were a very marvel and silver discoveries had transpired. If the mine was a developed one and had no pay ore to show, and of course it hadn't, we praised the tunnel, said it was one of the most infatuating tunnels in the land, driveled and driveled about the tunnel till we ran entirely out of ecstasies, but never said a word about the rock. We would squander half a column of adulation on a shaft, or a new wire rope, or a dressed pine windlass, or a fascinating force pump, and close with a burst of admiration of the gentlemanly and efficient superintendent of the mine, but never utter a whisper about the rock. And those people were always pleased, always satisfied. Occasionally, we patched up and varnished our reputation for discrimination and stern, undeviating accuracy by giving some old, abandoned claim a blast that ought to have made its dry bones rattle, and then somebody would seize it and sell it on the fleeting notoriety thus conferred upon it. There was nothing in the shape of a mining claim that was not saleable. We received presents of feet every day. If we needed $100 or so, we sold some. If not, we hoarded it away, satisfied that it would ultimately be worth $1,000 a foot. I had a trunk about half full of stock. When a claim made a stir in the market and went up to a high figure, I searched through my pile to see if I had any of its stock, and generally found it. The prices rose and fell constantly, but still, a fall disturbed us little because $1,000 a foot was our figure, and so we were content to let it fluctuate as much as it pleased till it reached it. My pile of stock was not all given to me by people who wished their claims noticed. At least half of it was given me by persons who had no thought of such a thing and looked for nothing more than a simple verbal thank you, and you were not even obliged by law to furnish that. If you are coming up the street with a couple of baskets of apples in your hand and you meet a friend, you naturally invite him to take a few. That describes the condition of things in Virginia in the flush times. Every man had his pockets full of stock, and it was the actual custom of the country to part with small quantities of it to friends without the asking. Very often it was a good idea to close the transaction instantly when a man offered a stock present to a friend, for the offer was only good and binding at that moment, and if the price went to a high figure shortly afterward, the procrastination was a thing to be regretted. Mr. Stewart, senator now from Nevada, one day told me he would give me 20 feet of justice stock if I would walk over to his office. It was worth $5 or $10 a foot. I asked him to make the offer good for next day, as I was just going to dinner. He said he would not be in town, so I risked it and took my dinner instead of the stock. Within the week, the price went up to $70 and afterward to $150, but nothing could make that man yield. I suppose he sold that stock of mine and placed the guilty proceeds in his own pocket. My revenge will be found in the accompanying portrait. I met three friends, one afternoon who said they had been buying Overman stock at auction at $8 a foot. One said if I would come up to his office, he would give me 15 feet. Another said he would add 15. The third said he would do the same. But I was going after an inquest and could not stop. A few weeks afterward, they sold all their Overmen at $600 a foot and generously came around to tell me about it and also to urge me to accept of the next 45 feet of it that people tried to force on me. These are actual facts, and I could make the list a long one and still confine myself strictly to the truth. Many a time, friends gave us as much as 25 feet of stock that was selling at $25 a foot, and they thought no more of it than they would of offering a guest a cigar. These were flush times indeed. I thought they were going to last always, but somehow I never was much of a prophet. To show what a wild spirit possessed the mining brain of the community, I will remark that claims were actually located in excavations for cellars where the pick had exposed what seemed to be quartz veins, and not cellars in the suburbs either, but in the very heart of the city, and forthwith stock would be issued and thrown on the market. It was small matter who the seller belonged to. The ledge belonged to the finder, and unless the United States government interfered, inasmuch as the government holds the primary right to mines of the noble metals in Nevada, or at least did then, it was considered to be his privilege to work it. Imagine a stranger staking out a mining claim among the costly shrubbery in your front yard and calmly proceeding to lay waste the ground with pick and shovel and blasting powder. It has been often done in California. In the middle of one of the principal business streets of Virginia, a man located a mining claim and began a shaft on it. He gave me 100 feet of the stock, and I sold it for a fine suit of clothes because I was afraid somebody would fall down the shaft and sue for damages. I owned in another claim that was located in the middle of another street, and to show how absurd people can be, that East India stock, as it was called, sold briskly, although there was an ancient tunnel running directly under the claim, and any man could go into it and see that it did not cut a quartz ledge or anything that remotely resembled one. One plan of acquiring sudden wealth was to salt a wildcat claim and sell out while the excitement was up. The process was simple. The schemer located a worthless ledge, sunk a shaft on it, bought a wagon load of rich Comstock ore, dumped a portion of it into the shaft, and piled the rest by the side, above ground. Then he showed the property to a simpleton and sold it to him at a high figure. Of course, the wagon load of rich ore was all that the victim ever got out of his purchase. A most remarkable case of salting was that of the North Ophir. It was claimed that this vein was a remote extension of the original Ophir, a valuable mine on the Comstock. For a few days, everybody was talking about the rich developments in the North Ophir. It was said that it yielded perfectly pure silver in small, solid lumps. I went to the place with the owners and found a shaft 6 or 8 feet deep, in the middle of which was a badly patterned vein of dull, yellowish, unpromising rock. One would as soon expect to find silver in a grindstone. We got out a pan of the rubbish and washed it in a puddle, and sure enough, among the sediment, we found half a dozen black, bullet-looking pellets of unimpeachable native silver. Nobody had ever heard of such a thing before. Science could not account for such a queer novelty. The stock rose to $65 a foot, and at this figure, the world-renowned tragedian McKean Buchanan bought a commanding interest and prepared to quit the stage once more. He was always doing that. And then it transpired that the mine had been salted, and not in any hackneyed way either, but in a singularly bold, bare-faced, and peculiarly original and outrageous fashion. On one of the lumps of native silver was discovered the minted legend, "Ted states of," and then it was plainly apparent that the mine had been salted with melted $half. The lumps thus obtained had been blackened till they resembled native silver, and were then mixed with the shattered rock in the bottom of the shaft. It is literally true. Of course, the price of the stock at once fell to nothing, and the tragedian was ruined. But for this calamity, we might have lost McKean Buchanan from the stage. Okay, chapter 45. The flush times held bravely on. Something over 2 years before, Mr. Goodman and another journeyman printer had borrowed $40 and set out from San Francisco to try their fortunes in the new city of Virginia. They found the Territorial Enterprise, a poverty-stricken weekly journal, gasping for breath and likely to die. They bought it, type, fixtures, goodwill, and all, for $1,000 on long time. The editorial sanctum, newsroom, press room, publication office, bedchamber, parlor, and kitchen were all compressed into one apartment, and it was a small one too. The editors and printers slept on the floor, a Chinaman did their cooking, and the imposing stone was the general dinner table. But now things were changed. The paper was a great daily, printed by steam. There were 5 editors and 23 compositors. The subscription price was $16 a year. The advertising rates were exorbitant, and the columns crowded. The paper was clearing from $6,000 to $10,000 a month, and the Enterprise building was finished and ready for occupation, a stately fireproof brick. Every day, from 5 all the way up to 11 columns of live advertisements were left out or crowded into spasmodic and irregular supplements. The Gould and Curry Company were erecting a monster 100-stamp mill at a cost that ultimately fell little short of $1 million. Wow. Gould and Curry stock paid heavy dividends, a rare thing, and an experience confined to the dozen or 15 claims located on the main lead, the Comstock. The superintendent of the Gould and Curry lived, rent-free, in a fine house built and furnished by the company. He drove a fine pair of horses which were a present from the company, and his salary was $12,000 a year. The superintendent of another of the great mines traveled in grand state, had a salary of $28,000 a year, and in a lawsuit in after days claimed that he was to have had 1% on the gross yield of the bullion likewise. Money was wonderfully plenty. The trouble was not how to get it, but how to spend it, how to lavish it, get rid of it, squander it. And so it was a happy thing that just at this juncture, the news came over the wires that a great United States Sanitary Commission had been formed, and money was wanted for the relief of the wounded sailors and soldiers of the Union languishing in the eastern hospitals. Right on the heels of it came word that San Francisco had responded superbly before the telegram was half a day old. Virginia rose as one man. A sanitary committee was hurriedly organized, and its chairman mounted a vacant cart in C Street and tried to make the clamorous multitude understand that the rest of the committee were flying hither and thither and working with all their might and main, and that if the town would only wait an hour, an office would be ready, books opened, and the commission prepared to receive contributions. His voice was drowned and his information lost in a ceaseless roar of cheers and demands that the money be received now. They swore they would not wait. The chairman pleaded and argued, but, deaf to all entreaty, men plowed their way through the throng and rained checks of gold coin into the cart and scurried away for more. Hands clutching money were thrust aloft out of the jam by men who hoped this eloquent appeal would cleave a road their strugglings could not open. The very Chinamen and Indians caught the excitement and dashed their $50 into the cart without knowing or caring what it was all about. Women plunged into the crowd, trimly attired, fought their way to the cart with their coin, and emerged again, by and by, with their apparel in a state of hopeless dilapidation. It was the wildest mob Virginia had ever seen, and the most determined and ungovernable. And when at last it abated its fury and dispersed, it had not a penny in its pocket. To use its own phraseology, it came there flush and went away busted. After that, the commission got itself into systematic working order, and for weeks the contributions flowed into its treasury in a generous stream. Individuals and all sorts of organizations levied upon themselves a regular weekly tax for the sanitary fund, graduated according to their means, and there was not another grand universal outburst till the famous sanitary flour sack came our way. Its history is peculiar and interesting. A former schoolmate of mine by the name of Ruel Gridley was living at the little city of Austin in the Reese River country at this time and was a Democratic candidate for mayor. He and the Republican candidate made an agreement that the defeated man should be publicly presented with a 50-pound sack of flour by the successful one and should carry it home on his shoulder. Gridley was defeated. The new mayor gave him the sack of flour, and he shouldered it and carried it a mile or two from Lower Austin to his home in Upper Austin, attended by a band of music and the whole population. Arrived there, he said he did not need the flour and asked what the people thought he had better do with it. A voice said, "Sell it to the highest bidder for the benefit of the sanitary fund." The suggestion was greeted with a round of applause, and Gridley mounted a dry goods box and assumed the role of auctioneer. The bids went higher and higher as the sympathies of the pioneers awoke and expanded, till at last the sack was knocked down to a millman at $250 and his check taken. He was asked where he would have the flour delivered, and he said, "Nowhere. Sell it again." Now the cheers went up royally, and the multitude were fairly in the spirit of the thing. So Gridley stood there and shouted and perspired till the sun went down. And when the crowd dispersed, he had sold the sack to 300 different people and had taken in $8,000 in gold. And still the flour sack was in his possession. The news came to Virginia, and a telegram went back, "Fetch along your flour sack." 36 hours afterward, Gridley arrived, and an afternoon mass meeting was held in the Opera House, and the auction began. But the sack had come sooner than it was expected. The people were not thoroughly aroused, and the sale dragged. At nightfall, only $5,000 had been secured, and there was a crestfallen feeling in the community. However, there was no disposition to let the matter rest here and acknowledge vanquishment at the hands of the village of Austin. Till late in the night, the principal citizens were at work arranging the morrow's campaign, and when they went to bed, they had no fears for the result. At 11 the next morning, a procession of open carriages, attended by clamorous bands of music and adorned with a moving display of flags, filed along C Street. It was soon in danger of blockade by a huzzaing multitude of citizens. In the first carriage sat Gridley, with the flour sack in prominent view, the latter splendid with bright paint and gilt lettering. Also in the same carriage sat the mayor and the recorder. The other carriages contained the common council, the editors and reporters, and other people of imposing consequence. The crowd pressed to the corner of C and Taylor Streets, expecting the sale to begin there, but they were disappointed, and also unspeakably surprised, for the cavalcade moved on as if Virginia had ceased to be of importance and took its way over the divide toward the small town of Gold Hill. Telegrams had gone ahead to Gold Hill, Silver City, and Dayton, and those communities were at fever heat and rife for the conflict. It was a very hot day and wonderfully dusty, At the end of a short half hour, we descended into Gold Hill with drums beating and colors flying, and enveloped in imposing clouds of dust. The whole population, men, women, and children, Chinamen and Indians, were massed in the main street. All the flags in town were at the masthead, and the blare of the bands was drowned in cheers. Gridley stood up and asked who would make the first bid for the National Sanitary Flour Sack. General W. said, "The Yellow Jacket Silver Mining Company offers $1,000. Coin." A tempest of applause followed. A telegram carried the news to Virginia, and 15 minutes afterward, that city's population was massed in the streets devouring the tidings, for it was part of the program that the bulletin boards should do a good work that day. Every few minutes, a new dispatch was bulletined from Gold Hill, and still the excitement grew. Telegrams began to return to us from Virginia, beseeching Gridley to bring back the flour sack, but such was not the plan of the campaign. At the end of an hour, Gold Hill's small population had paid a figure for the flour sack that awoke all the enthusiasm of Virginia when the grand total was displayed upon the bulletin boards. Then the Gridley cavalcade moved on, a giant refreshed with new lager beer and plenty of it, for the people brought it to the carriages without waiting to measure it. And within 3 hours more, the expedition had carried Silver City and Dayton by storm and was on its way back, covered with glory. Every move had been telegraphed and bulletined, and as the procession entered Virginia and filed down C Street at 8:30 in the evening, the town was abroad in the thoroughfares. Torches were glaring, flags flying, bands playing, cheer on cheer cleaving the air, and the city ready to surrender at discretion. The auction began. Every bid was greeted with bursts of applause, and at the end of 2 hours and a half, a population of 15,000 souls had paid in coin for a 50-pound sack of flour, a sum equal to $40,000 in greenbacks. It was at a rate in the neighborhood of $3 for each man, woman, and child of the population. The grand total would have been twice as large, but the streets were very narrow, and hundreds who wanted to bid could not get within a block of the stand and could not make themselves heard. These grew tired of waiting, and many of them went home long before the auction was over. This was the greatest day Virginia ever saw, perhaps. Gridley sold the sack in Carson City and several California towns, also in San Francisco. Then he took it east and sold it in 1 or 2 Atlantic cities, I think. I am not sure of that, but I know that he finally carried it to St. Louis, where a monster sanitary fair was being held, and after selling it there for a large sum and helping on the enthusiasm by displaying the portly silver bricks which Nevada's donation had produced, he had the flour baked up into small cakes and retailed that at high prices. It was estimated that when the flour sack's mission was ended, it had been sold for a grand total of $150,000 in greenbacks. This is probably the only instance on record where common family flour brought $3,000 a pound in the public market. It is due to Mr. Gridley's memory to mention that the expenses of his sanitary flax sour expedition of 15,000 miles going and returning were paid in large part, if not entirely, out of his own pocket. The time he gave to it was not less than 3 months. Mr. Gridley was a soldier in the Mexican War and a pioneer Californian. He died at Stockton, California in December 1870, greatly regretted. And finally, chapter 46. There were nabobs in those days, in the flush times, I mean. Every rich strike in the mines created 1 or 2. I call to mind several of these. They were careless, easygoing fellows as a general thing, and the community at large was as much benefited by their riches as they were themselves, possibly more in some cases. 2 cousins, teamsters, did some hauling for a man and had to take a small segregated portion of a silver mine in lieu of $300 cash. They gave an outsider a third to open the mine and then went on teaming, but not long. 10 months afterward, the mine was out of debt and paying each owner $8,000 to $10,000 a month. Say $100,000 a year. One of the earliest nabobs that Nevada was delivered of wore $6,000 worth of diamonds in his bosom and swore he was unhappy because he could not spend his money as fast as he made it. Another Nevada nabob boasted an income that often reached $16,000 a month, and he used to love to tell how he had worked in the very mine that yielded it for $5 a day when he first came to the country. The silver and sagebrush state his knowledge of another of these pets of fortune, lifted from actual poverty to affluence almost in a single night, who was able to offer $100,000 for a position of high official distinction shortly afterward, and did offer it, but failed to get it, his politics not being as sound as his bank account. Then there was John Smith. He was a good, honest, kind-hearted soul, born and reared in the lower ranks of life, and miraculously ignorant. He drove a team and owned a small ranch, a ranch that paid him a comfortable living, for although it yielded but little hay, what little it did yield was worth from $250 to $300 in gold per ton in the market. Presently, Smith traded a few acres of the ranch for a small, undeveloped silver mine in Gold Hill. He opened the mine and built a little, unpretending 10-stamp mill. 18 months afterward, he retired from the hay business, for his mining income had reached a most comfortable figure. Some people said it was $30,000 a month, and others said it was $60,000. Smith was very rich, at any rate. And then he went to Europe and traveled, and when he came back, he was never tired of telling about the fine hogs he had seen in England, and the gorgeous sheep he had seen in Spain, and the fine cattle he had noticed in the vicinity of Rome. He was full of the wonders of the old world, and advised everybody to travel. He said a man never imagined what surprising things there were in the world till he had traveled. One day, on board ship, the passengers made up a pool of $500, which was to be the property of the man who should come nearest to guessing the run of the vessel for the next 24 hours. Next day, toward noon, the figures were all in the purser's hands in sealed envelopes. Smith was serene and happy, for he had been bribing the engineer. But another party won the prize. Smith said, "Here, that won't do. He guessed 2 miles wider of the mark than I did." The purser said, "Mr. Smith, you missed it further than any man on board. We traveled 208 miles yesterday." "Well, sir," said Smith, "that's just where I've got you, for I guessed 209. If you'll look at my figures again, you'll find a 2 and 2 zeros, which stands for 200, don't it? And after them, you'll find a 9, 2009, which stands for 209. I reckon I'll take that money, if you please." The gold and Curry claim comprised 1,200 feet, and it all belonged originally to the 2 men whose names it bears. Mr. Curry owned 2/3 of it, and he said that he sold it out for $2,500 in cash and an old plug horse that ate up his market value in hay and barley in 17 days by the watch. And he said that Gould sold out for a pair of second-hand government blankets and a bottle of whiskey that killed 9 men in 3 hours, and that an unoffending stranger that smelt the cork was disabled for life. 4 years afterward, the mine thus disposed of was worth in the San Francisco market $7,600,000 in gold coin. In the early days, a poverty-stricken Mexican who lived in a canyon directly back of Virginia City had a stream of water as large as a man's wrist trickling from the hillside on his premises. The Ophir Company segregated 100 feet of their mine and traded it to him for the stream of water. The 100 feet proved to be the richest part of the entire mine. 4 years after the swap, its market value, including the mill, was $1.5 million. An individual who owned 20 feet in the Ophir mine before its great riches were revealed to men traded it for a horse, and a very sorry-looking brute he was, too. A year or so afterward, when Ophir stock went up to $3,000 a foot, this man, who had not a cent, used to say he was the most startling example of magnificence and misery the world had ever seen, because he was able to ride a $60,000 horse, yet could not scrape up cash enough to buy a saddle and was obliged to borrow one or ride bareback. He said if fortune were to give him another $60,000 horse, it would ruin him. A youth of 19 who was a telegraph operator in Virginia on a salary of $100 a month, and who, when he could not make out German names in the list of San Francisco steamer arrivals, used to ingeniously select and supply substitutes for them out of an old Berlin city directory, made himself rich by watching the mining telegrams that passed through his hands and buying and selling stocks accordingly through a friend in San Francisco. Once, when a private dispatch was sent from Virginia announcing a rich strike in a prominent mine and advising that the matter be kept secret till a large amount of the stock could be secured, he bought 40 feet of the stock at $20 a foot, and afterwards sold half of it at $800 a foot, and the rest at double that figure. Within 3 months, he was worth $150,000 and had resigned his telegraphic position. Another telegraph operator who had been discharged by the company for divulging the secrets of the office agreed with a moneyed man in San Francisco to furnish him the result of a great Virginia mining lawsuit within an hour after its private reception by the parties of it in San Francisco. For this, he was to have a large percentage of the profits on purchases and sales made on it by his fellow conspirator. So he went, disguised as a teamster, to a little wayside telegraph office in the mountains, got acquainted with the operator, and sat in the office day after day, smoking his pipe, complaining that his team was fagged out and unable to travel, and meantime, listening to the dispatches as they passed clicking through the machine from Virginia. Finally, the private dispatch announcing the result of the lawsuit sped over the wires, and as soon as he heard it, he telegraphed his friend in San Francisco, "Am tired of waiting. Shall sell the team and go home." It was the signal agreed upon. The word "waiting" left out would have signified that the suit had gone the other way. The mock teamster's friend picked up a deal of the mining stock at low figures before the news became public, and a fortune was the result. For a long time after one of the great Virginia mines had been incorporated, about 50 feet of the original location were still in the hands of a man who had never signed the incorporation papers. The stock became very valuable, and every effort was made to find this man, but he had disappeared. Once it was heard that he was in New York, and one or two speculators went east, but failed to find him. Once the news came that he was in the Bermudas, and straightaway a speculator or two hurried east and sailed for Bermuda, but he was not there. Finally, he was heard of in Mexico, and a friend of his, a barkeeper on a salary, scraped together a little money and sought him out, bought his feet for $100, returned, and sold the property for $75,000. But why go on? The traditions of Silverland are filled with instances like these, and I would never get through enumerating them were I to attempt to do it. I only desired to give the reader an idea of the peculiarity of the flush times, which I could not present so strikingly in any other way, and which some mention of was necessary to a realizing comprehension of the time and the country. I was personally acquainted with the majority of the nabobs I have referred to, and so, for old acquaintance' sake, I have shifted their occupations and experiences around in such a way as to keep the Pacific public from recognizing these once notorious men. No longer notorious, for the majority of them have drifted back into poverty and obscurity again. In Nevada, there used to be current the story of an adventure of two of her nabobs, which may or may not have occurred. I give it for what it is worth. Colonel Jim had seen somewhat of the world and knew more or less of its ways. But Colonel Jack was from the back settlements of the States, had led a life of arduous toil, and had never seen a city. These two, blessed with sudden wealth, projected a visit to New York, Colonel Jack to see the sights, and Colonel Jim to regard his unsophistication from misfortune. They reached San Francisco in the night and sailed in the morning. Arrived in New York, Colonel Jack said, "I've heard tell of carriages all my life, and now I mean to have a ride in one. I don't care what it costs. Come along." They stepped out on the sidewalk, and Colonel Jim called a stylish barouche. But Colonel Jack said, "No, sir. None of your cheap John turnouts for me. I'm here to have a good time, and money ain't any object. I mean to have the nobbiest rig that's going. Now here comes the very trick. Stop that yaller one with the pictures on it. Don't you fret. I'll stand all the expenses myself." So Colonel Jim stopped an empty omnibus, and they got in. Said Colonel Jack, "Ain't it gay, though? Oh, no, I reckon not. Cushions and windows and pictures till you can't rest. What would the boys say if they could see us cutting a swell like this in New York? By George, I wish they could see us." Then he put his head out the window and shouted to the driver, "Say, Johnny, this suits me. Suits yours truly, you bet you. I want this shebang all day. I'm on it, old man. Let him out. Make him go. We'll make it all right with you, sonny." The driver passed his hand through the strap hole and tapped for his fare, and it was before the gongs came into common use. Colonel Jack took the hand and shook it cordially. He said, "You twig me, old pard. All right between gents. Smell of that and see how you like it." And he put a $20 gold piece in the driver's hand. After a moment, the driver said he could not make change. "Bother the change. Write it out. Put it in your pocket." Then to Colonel Jim, with a resounding slap on the thigh, "Ain't it style, though? Hanged if I don't hire this thing every day for a week." The omnibus stopped and a young lady got in. Colonel Jack stared a moment, then nudged Colonel Jim with his elbow. Don't say a word, he whispered. Let her ride if she wants to. Gracious, there's room enough. The young lady got out her porte-monnaie and handed her fare to Colonel Jack. What's this for? Said he. Give it to the driver, please. Take back your money, madam. We can't allow it. You're welcome to ride here as long as you please, but this shebang's chartered. We can't let you pay a cent. The girl shrunk into a corner, bewildered. An old lady with a basket climbed in and proffered her fare. Excuse me, said Colonel Jack. You're perfectly welcome here, madam, but we can't allow you to pay. Set right down there, mum, and don't you be the least uneasy. Make yourself just as free as if you was in your own turn out. Within 2 minutes, 3 gentlemen, 2 fat women, and a couple of children entered. Come right along, friends, said Colonel Jack. Don't mind us. This is a free blowout. Then he whispered to Colonel Jim. New York ain't no sociable place, I don't reckon. It ain't no name for it. He resisted every effort to pass fares to the driver and made everybody cordially welcome. The situation dawned on the people, and they pocketed their money and delivered themselves up to covert enjoyment of the episode. Half a dozen more passengers entered. Oh, there's plenty of room, said Colonel Jack. Walk right in and make yourselves at home. A blowout ain't worth anything as a blowout unless a body has company. Then in a whisper to Colonel Jim, but ain't these New Yorkers friendly? And ain't they cool about it, too? Icebergs ain't anywhere. I reckon they'd tackle a hearse if it was going their way. More passengers got in, more yet, and still more. Both seats were filled, and a file of men were standing up, holding on to the cleats overhead. Parties with baskets and bundles were climbing up on the roof. Half-suppressed laughter rippled up from all sides. Well, for clean, cool, out-and-out cheek, if this don't bang anything that ever I saw, I'm an Injun, whispered Colonel Jack. A Chinaman crowded his way in. I weaken, said Colonel Jack. Hold on, driver. Keep your seats, ladies and gents. Just make yourselves free. Everything's paid for. Driver, rustle these folks around as long as they're a mind to go. Friends of ours, you know. Take them everywheres, and if you want more money, come to the St. Nicholas and we'll make it all right. Pleasant journey to you, ladies and gents. Go it just as long as you please. It shan't cost you a cent. The 2 comrades got out, and Colonel Jack said, Jimmy, it's the sociablest place I ever saw. The Chinaman waltzed in as comfortable as everybody. Ooh. If we'd stayed a while, I reckon we'd had some niggers. Sorry. But George, we'll have to barricade our doors tonight or some of these ducks will be trying to sleep with us. That concludes today's reading, and I just want to say one more time, I am so sorry about some of the offensive language in the story. Remember, it's a book of its time. But yeah. Other than that, a really fun story about some nabobs from the Nevada Territory traveling to New York and discovering kind of what a bus is and not quite understanding how it works. So thank you very much for joining me today for our another reading of from Roughing It by Mark Twain. And as mentioned earlier, if you want to tune in at 5-ish to the virtual hub, I'm going to be making origami into flowers and then turning it into a really beautiful ball. So if you'd like to learn how to do that today, I'll be doing that at 5. Isn't that pretty though? I just thought it so neat how it has like the little bits inside to make like the center of the flower. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, and I will see you next time. Take care. Bye.